All right, guys, round two. I finished the episode of Joe Rogan with KRESSER and James Wilkes. Listening to that, it was continued to be painful to listen to. James Wilkes's continued attack on Chris KRESSER's credentials was, a bit silly. I mean, this is the thing that I'll talk about. He says, well, Chris can't read a forest plot, therefore you're unqualified to read the research. Or, Chris, you don't know how the DIAS, the dispensable amino acid score was, digestibility of indispensable amino acid scores was derived, or all the ins and outs about that. And therefore, you are not qualified to evaluate any evidence. I mean, you're just a stupid idiot that has no qualification. You shouldn't even make a word. And I think, let me tell you, I had... on my podcast, about a year ago, I had Professor Jose Antonio, one of the eminent protein sports medicine, American Academy of College of Sports Medicine guys, well-respected guy. And I asked him, I said, Jose, what do you think about the DIAS versus the PDCAS? About protein? And he goes, man, I don't know. I don't really pay attention to that stuff. It's not in my wheel. I don't really care. I'm not really worried about that, right? So, Professor Jose Antonio, because he doesn't know the derivation of the DIAS, is therefore unqualified to comment on anything in the literature. This is a straw man thing. You can say, you can't read a forest plot. Well, I guarantee I can find well-respected researchers that can't understand certain statistical techniques or can't by hand do a NOVA analysis. There are a lot of people out there that just because you say they can't do one thing, therefore they're unqualified. So it's a total bullshit from James Wilkes and his bullshit, the way he debated. But besides the point, Chris should have done a better job sticking up for himself. I'd say that. So we go on to some points. Wilkes is saying, well, there's some studies out there that show that beef causes inflammation acutely. Now, is that inflammation bad long term? Is that a short period of inflammation? When we exercise, we cause inflammation. Do we know that causes a problem long term? Is there a study that shows that? Can you show me a study that eating beef, a real study, not the bullshit epidemiology, not the bullshit short-term mechanistic study, which doesn't mean anything, right? You can show anything does almost anything, good or bad. You can make those studies appear, but to say that beef causes inflammation temporarily after you eat it, and therefore it means evil things, there's no data to support that. There is no randomized control trial looking at people eating beef or all beef like I do, showing that they're chronically inflamed or leading to some disease. In fact, in the carnivore population, which I happen to observe every day, we see chronic inflammation going down. We see that both subjectively, clinically, as well as with objective laboratory data like CRP, like IL-6, like tumor necrosis factor alpha. So that is, again, another sort of, I don't understand the evidence. I got some mechanistic data, and I'm going to extrapolate it too. That means gloom and doom and death. Doesn't mean that, James. You need to figure out what you're talking about and what your experts need to talk about. Listen to Gordon Guyatt. You got to have information. You have to have hard endpoints with randomized controlled trials to show you that something actually is relevant. Other than that, you're just mentally masturbating and flapping your gums. All right? Let's talk about industry funding. He keeps talking about industry this, industry that. And he talks about conflicts of interest. You can't trust any of that. Well, guess what? He brings up the American Academy or the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and their plant-based diet is good for all ages and stages. But he doesn't tell you that every single one of the authors, all three of the authors, are ethical vegans that have vegan cookbooks. One's a Seventh-day Adventist lecturer. All of those guys have a conflict of interest. He doesn't mention that part in the debate, does he? No, he forgets to talk about that. Pull up the American Academy, the Academy of Dietetics and Nutritionists position paper from 2016 saying that vegan diets are appropriate. Look at the authors and then Google what the authors do. You'll see conflict of interest. And then if you go far enough and look at the reviewers, you will also see that many of those reviewers also have a conflict of interest. And so conflict of interest goes lots of ways, okay? And this guy sits there and talks about consensus statements, and then you can't use individual studies, and then he goes and uses individual studies. It's just silly. And he complains about stuff that he does himself, right? He goes on to talk about the Nutri-X organization and that they were funded by industry and they had a sugar recommendation. But what he doesn't tell you, there was no industry funding for the Nutri-X study on meat. There was no industry funding. They were clear about that. Brad Johnson, the central author, the primary author, said he wanted to make sure there was no industry study in this. And they're saying that he had a financial conflict of interest. He took no money during the period of the Nutri-X study on red meat. The only thing is that the study he did previously was published, a year later, but he had no money there. So there's no money in that. The other thing that he talks about is that, the Nutri-X study was not in line with the consensus, and therefore we should throw it out. Chris brings up a lot of other meta-analysis, which he conveniently ignores as well. I mean, he just talks over Chris. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to talk real loud and fast. This is what he's doing the whole time. And, and Joe's is sitting there, listening to James, because James talking the loudest and the most. And I don't think people understand what the evidence shows, okay? So back to the Nutri-X organization, he talks about the World Health Organization. Well, guess who recognizes the grade classification? Guess who recognizes a grade classification as a valid systematic review tool? The World Health Organization. They are one of the 110 international organizations that accepts grade, okay? So does the Cochrane Collaboration, and many, many others say that grade is valid for evaluating evidence, including nutritional evidence, guys. So this is the thing, and he's talking about a science advisor. Michael Greger was a science advisor to this movie. He doesn't mention that. Michael Greger is incredibly biased, as we know. He talks about, scientific consensus. Well, guess what? A consensus of weak evidence is not particularly good evidence. I'll make this point over and over again. You can do all of the meta-analysis of weak evidence until you show a randomized control trial of an outcome that actually counts. How long am I going to live? Am I going to get a disease? Am I going to die of cancer? Am I going to die of heart disease? And you do an actual study using actual people for a long period of time. You control all the things. Everything else is BS. The level of quality of evidence is very low. So we keep leaning on this stuff. We talk about biochemistry, pure biochemistry. It's indisputable what humans require for nutrition. They need essential amino acids, they need essential fatty acids, they need vitamins, they need minerals. That is the human requirement. They don't need phytonutrients, they don't need fiber. That is what biochemistry tells us. The rest of the stuff is epidemiologic BS, okay? He talks about, Chris is like, why is red meat bad? James never, ever, at least in this debate, tells us why red meat is bad. There's no, again, James, show me a randomized controlled trial over a long period of time on people eating a meat-heavy diet that is well controlled, where the confounders are controlled, where we look at hard endpoints. It doesn't exist, so therefore you cannot say red meat is bad for you. All right, we then get into this protein argument, and this was painful to listen to, where they argue back and forth about how many calories to get how many grams of protein and blah, 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 blah. So let's talk about, let's go to volume instead of protein. Let's use that metric instead. How many friggin' cups of broccoli or beans do I have to eat to equal the same amount of protein on a small piece of beef? That's a probably more relevant argument. How much volume do you need to eat? Maybe you can stuff yourself and eat 7 or 8 times a day and spike insulin repeatedly. Maybe that's a better option for you. But when you only talk about calories, that is not necessarily the only metric we need to talk about. And we also, and outside of protein, when we talk about beef, creatine, carnosine, carnitine, taurine, zinc, higher amounts of leucine, higher amounts of arginine, higher amounts of lysine. These things are relevant outside of just protein. And then he goes on to talk about the PDCAS versus the DIAS. And again, the difference is PDCAS, how much protein you take in, how much comes out the back end. What comes out is what you didn't absorb. With the DIAS, you see what goes in, what goes through the small intestine, and then what comes out. Because what happens is in the colon, you have, like he pointed out, you have microbiomes that can affect the protein, and the microbiome protein itself can get measured. You get a falsely elevated reading. And when they did DIAS, they saw significant improvements in the bioavailability of proteins, things like beef, dairy, eggs, relative to plant foods, which were very low relative. We're talking like 120 versus 40. It might be milk or beef versus 40 with bread or nuts or things, or certain other proteins. soy being the best for plant protein. And so he says this is not applicable to it's only applicable to starving people. Where is a consensus statement that says we should only use this on starving patients? I've never seen that. Can you show that to us? You say it's not applicable to athletes. Do you have a better system that's out there that's been widely adopted that shows that the FAO has recognized for athletes, or any other, the American College of Sports Medicine has recognized as a better system? You don't have that. And so right now the DIAS is as good as it gets. Now it may be revised later. We clearly see that Mr. Olympia is not vegan. So I mean, you can just look at some of the actual human results that we've seen. When he talks about leucine requirements, leucine is much lower in plant food. Talking to guys like Don Layman and Stu Phillips, some of the best protein researchers in the world, will all clearly say that animal protein is a better source of protein. That's clear. James admits that in the movie. He says that if you eat enough beans, you might be able to get your thing. That's fine. Chris is saying it's harder to get lysine. It's harder to get arginine. Also will stimulate mTOR and MPS for you guys that don't know. And he talks about 1.8. I think Stu Phillips and those guys will say 2.5 to 3. Don Layman as well, as far as grams of leucine required to kick in mTOR, right, and create muscle protein synthesis. He used this analogy as jiu-jitsu scoring is not appropriate for MMA. Well, the DIAS scoring works in human beings. You do not have an alternative scoring for human beings or athletes saying that soy is better or just as good as meat, because it doesn't exist. It's clearly an issue there. So when we get to the endothelial dysfunction stuff, again, this is another mechanistic BS argument regardless. He says, I've got a study here that shows that we see some endothelial dysfunction after a meal of whipping cream and chocolate syrup, right? And then he goes on to criticize Chris for saying, well, some of those low-fat diets you used had white flour in there, a sugary type thing, a high carb thing. Well, what about the freaking chocolate syrup? You just gloss over that. Whipping cream plus chocolate syrup. Who's drinking whipping cream? Who's recommending that? Eating meat is very much different. I don't sit there and drink whipped cream, right? So I mean, this is just, and again, does short-term transient hyperlipidemia, hypertriglyceridemia result in death, cardiovascular disease, cancer, whatever? No evidence that shows that. There is no evidence that you can say. There's no randomized controlled trials with long-term outcomes, so all you're doing is speculating based on mechanisms. We don't know if a short-term elevation in even endothelial dysfunction in a very brief time postprandially results in dead people dying of heart attacks. There's no evidence to support that. That's all pure speculation. So learn about the evidence. Learn about hard endpoints, clinical endpoints that count, and not this silly mechanistic stuff, because you guys get your heads all wound around, ooh, there's a mechanism. Well, guess what? There's a lot of mechanisms for everything. We don't fully understand those mechanisms. As Chris pointed out, there are dozens of studies that say it goes the other way. And of course, James says, well, those studies don't count because I haven't had a chance to read them. And then he springs on some study at the end about DIAS, and there's a new thing showing that plant proteins are better available than we thought previously. Again, one study, not a consensus statement. We don't know if that's going to hold up in another study. And so this whole thing of you don't go with the consensus, you're putting single studies, Chris, but here's my single study, which doesn't have a consensus. So absolute, one-sided debate where he engaged in tactics and then, used them himself and then discounted them in other people. So I was again sort of laughing to see this. I couldn't watch it much more. Here's what I would suggest. You get somebody like Gordon Guyatt on the show. You get somebody like Don Layman on the show. You get somebody like Stu Phillips on the show. And you get some vegan some vegan researcher on there. If you want somebody to talk about a carnivore diet, obviously I can do that. But this is just people can't interpret. They see somebody yelling loudly and showing a lot of studies and flashing a lot of slides and thinking that, oh wow, he's showing this endothelial dysfunction or this beef inflammation, and therefore it means something, outside of just that there's temporary inflammation. That's not how what we want to know works. I want to know what's going to give me the best performance long term, what's going to make me live longer, what's going to keep me healthy. And none of the research that he presented would indicate that eating meat is going to do anything negative to that, or eating a plant-based diet is superior in that regard. I mean, it's all just mechanistic BS coupled with epidemiology, which is so weak. I mean, this whole debate was a waste of time, you know, and in fact, me talking about it's kind of a waste of time. But all we're seeing is people arguing over data that is totally weak. It's totally weak. And so this is the problem. This is the problem with nutrition science in general, guys. So anyway, keep it with a grain of salt. You know, I feel sorry for Chris. You know, it was almost insulting to. I mean, he was being insulted by this guy, and it's unfortunate. But anyway, that's the way it goes. You know, it's all's fair in love and war, and you play hard, right? All right, guys. Take care, and we'll see you on the next video. Take care.